So welcome everyone to this, our fourth webinar as Faith for the Climate, with our theme Creating a New Hope for the Earth. Now, how this webinar came about is, as Cliff was saying, Dr. Crockeram was saying, this is very much the month of season of creation for Christians around the world. It's an ecumenical festival. Here we know it as Creation Tide in the UK. So we were wondering, as Faith for the Climate, how do you balance faith and climate action, and faith and practical action alongside your climate action as people of faith? Because this is very much the theme, as Cliff was saying, this is the Pope's message now as well, in terms of the Catholic Church's aims with Laudato Si and the environment and so on. And in the UK, this is very much tied to Climate Sunday, which is an initiative by churches in Britain and Ireland to hold climate theme events during Sunday worship during September and October. But we are Faith for the Climate, and I've just introduced to you that we are a multi-faith network. So while we hold this as a very important part of the faith calendar in terms of climate action, we don't want this to be Christian-centric or Christian-led. And we also know that this month it's the Jewish High Holy Days. So I'm very pleased that today we will be joined by, first of all, Hannah Brown, who's Methodist and works for the Joint Public Issues team, to give the Climate Sunday season of creation side of the story. And then we move on to Talia, who is the founder of a Jewish farm, a farm based on Jewish principles called Sadeh. And she's also a trustee of Faith for the Climate, because we know this month it's Rosh Hashanah on Thursday, Friday, and then it moves on to Yom Kippur. So it's the High Holy Days. So how does that connect for Jewish communities? We don't expect any of our speakers to represent the entire faith, but this webinar will be more about, well, what does this mean to them in their traditions and how they take this on personally as well, because they're all very much involved in climate action, each of them. And again, the danger with these sorts of things is then, if you have a Jewish and Christian story, it can get very Abrahamic and very theistic, and I don't want this to be that kind of event. So we've also invited perspectives from Gopal Patel, who is the director and founder of Bhumi Global, and Kaspalita Thompson, who is the founder of Buddhist Action Month and is very actively involved in Extinction Rebellion Buddhist as well. Because we can talk about creation, people of faith caring for creation, but do those concepts even work beyond the theistic Abrahamic world? So let's have a discussion about that. And if there are areas where, things have to go a certain way, where there's no way to have an interfaith consensus on something, that's fine. But I think the purpose of these webinars is so that we can identify these areas and identify how we can work together more effectively from our different faith perspectives. And what are the issues that some of us might come up against when things are put in a certain way. But ultimately, it is about each and every one of us feeling very spiritually connected to our climate action, to our climate work in the world as it is now. And we know that it's an emergency. It's getting more and more serious. So what do we as people of faith, of different faiths, bring? And how can we make this work for us? Right. So without further ado, I would like to invite Hannah Brown to kick off the discussion. Hannah, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Shanon. It's really good to be with you all this afternoon for us here in the UK. So as Shanon said, I work for the Methodist Church as part of something called the Joint Public Issues team. So what we are is the Methodist Church in the UK, but also the United Reformed Church, the Baptist Union, and the Church of Scotland, all based in the UK, kind of pooling our resources together on public issues work. So we kind of seek to empower churches and the Christians who make them up to be speaking out on issues of peace and justice. So kind of providing information and resourcing, kind of mobilization tools to help churches not just grow in their action, but also their kind of exploration of peace and justice as a key part of their faith expression. So we're really involved with Climate Sunday that Shanon has explained a little bit, which is a new initiative this year as part of Season of Creation, kind of beginning with that, but also growing the whole year in the lead up to COP26 in the UK in Glasgow next year. which is really using the opportunity of COP being in the UK as a catalyst for greater faith action on the climate. So part of Climate Sunday is we're encouraging all churches who are part of our networks to get involved with kind of 3 stages of action. So that's holding a climate service and really rooting themselves in worship and reflection around the climate, making a commitment to take their church and their community to the next step of climate action for themselves. So what would be the next action that they could take within their own community that would move forward their action on the climate in their own lifestyles, but also calling for change on a national and international level. So how can the church be speaking out prophetically as part of the movement for climate justice? So we're really keen that actually through Climate Sunday, through Season of Creation, we're encouraging churches to go on that whole journey, to start at a place of worship and to move into places of change, both in their own spheres of influence, but also extending that further to kind of national and international change. So this year's Season of Creation theme is a Jubilee for the Earth, and I think that's a really helpful way of unpacking why worship and action should be and are integrally kind of connected when we're looking at calling for climate justice. So for me, for deep-rooted climate action to take place and be sustainable in the way that we need it to be, it has to start from a real belief that systemic and lifestyle change is necessary and possible. And I think to do this, we need a vision of what a world where climate justice is upheld and all people and creation can flourish actually looks like. And I think worship is that space where as people of faith we begin to deepen that vision, and we understand and we kind of explore how we relate to God, how we relate to one another, and how we relate to creation as a starting point for kind of building that vision. And the theme of Jubilee for the Earth, I think, is a really practical example for this. So Jubilee is an economic and systems-based process kind of found in the Judeo-Christian tradition that is rooted in a much deeper spiritual principle. So if you aren't aware already, Jubilee is a proposal where there's a cycle of debt amnesty. So debts are cancelled, land is restored, and in a Jubilee year, you don't work the land, but you live off what the land has already provided, and there's respite for creation in that sense. And it's proposed in a cycle of around 50 years. And I think for me, where that really practical principle really comes from is a bigger vision of right relationship. So a vision where actually as part of what a flourishing creation looks like, there's right relationship between people and each other within community, people and creation, and people and God. And the Jubilee is a tool to kind of build and maintain relationships that seek to reflect the dignity and worth that we believe everything and everyone is created with. And so I think that's an example of how we take a really hopeful vision for change and for restored creation and translate that into really practical action and really practical structures for how we live that out. And I think worship is the place where we kind of deepen and strengthen that vision as to where this process and this principle starts from. So as we spend time in prayer and discussion and praise, we deepen that vision of what fullness of life is. And I think the last thing I would say is that I don't think there's a place where kind of worship stops and action starts, but actually our action is a continuation of our worship. Our worship has to be extended all the way to kind of creating and upholding the processes and the systems and the structures that will bring about this vision for change and for right relationship. And as we act, we learn better and we become part of building that vision, and that becomes part of our worship too. So as people of faith, as Christians, we have kind of a duty to honour action as part of our worship as well. So I think that's my kind of quick whistle-stop tour through kind of our involvement in Climate Sunday and Season of Creation as well.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Hannah. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to start flooding the chat box with them, or raise your hand. I should be able to see if you raise your hand in the participants list. Hannah, I guess what I really take away from your reflection is that for you, like you said, the boundary between worship and action is, it's not a solid boundary. There's no end to one and the beginning to another. And I just wondered if you could give an example of that. Like, how would that look like for you personally?
Yeah, I think for me personally, that goes both ways in that kind of in the spaces that I might traditionally associate with being spaces of worship. So in meetings together on a Sunday, for example, or meetings with my faith community, those are places where we can be discussing, where we can be taking action, where we can be mobilizing as part of our worship. So kind of taking action into those traditionally worship-based spaces, but also moving kind of our worship into spaces that we would traditionally associate with action. So taking action, whether that's kind of practical demonstrations, going out on protests, or raising our voice in discussion, doing that in a prayerful way, in a way that feels like I'm not just connecting with the people around me as I'm doing that, but I'm connecting with God as I'm doing that as well. So dedicating that moment to God in prayer, really reflecting on, and discerning whether it's a place and an action that expresses God's kind of attitude towards people and towards creation as I'm taking action. So I think moving the kind of boundaries of those spaces are kind of across each other.
Mm. I like that a lot. I was speaking to someone who said, look, if it's just a conversation, but if it's in a space where that conversation has never been had, if it's never taken place, that's action, that's groundbreaking. So if you're in a church environment where a congregation has not discussed before what they can do on climate action as a conversation, just having that conversation to start with, that's an action, isn't it? So I really like that.
Absolutely.
We have a question in the chat box. Is Climate Sunday a particular Sunday in September, or does it run throughout the month?
Yeah, so Climate Sunday is kind of a broader initiative that was launched in September of this year and will run all the way through to the September next year. And what we're encouraging people to do is hold a Climate Sunday on any Sunday in that time period. And they will all kind of culminate in one focus Sunday next September, where we'll bring together everyone's actions. So actually it's an invitation for you to hold a Climate Sunday on any day. We launched on the 6th of September this year, but on any Sunday in the next year.
Thank you. Giles, you've got your hand raised.
Thanks, Hannah. That's really good. And I love the connection between the community and action and worship, because you can't do these things on your own, can you? You can't do worship on your own. You can't really do actions on your own. But I was just thinking about the interfaith aspect, obviously, because Climate Sunday is specifically a Christian thing. But I suppose I'm really hoping that other faith traditions might be able to come alongside. Has that been talked about at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think because the initiative kind of originated from a group of churches, that's really kind of where the strength has been in developing it. But I think as a group and as kind of churches, more than open to how that can be done in an interfaith way, whether that's on a local level or nationally. So actually churches who are holding their own Climate Sundays, wouldn't it be amazing if they got involved with it, with other faith presences in their local communities, and looked at how that can be done locally in an interfaith way as well as nationally in an interfaith way. So we've got a whole year to experiment and be creative with this and really strengthen our voice as faiths together. So it'd be really exciting if we saw that happen.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah. There will be time for a further Q&A at the end, but right now I will welcome Talia. Talia Chain for your presentation. Talia, you have 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's Talia Chain, but it probably was Chain like 50 years ago. Yeah, so just a little bit of background on me and Sadeh Farm and what we do. Sadeh Farm is a Jewish farm based on the border of London and Kent in Orpington. It's like just as soon as you in the city, and then you drive out into the countryside, and there you are at Sadeh. I started just a very small, like, vegetable growing kind of educational plot in January 2017, and then March 2018, so just 2 years ago, the site where the plot is has a big retreat center and owns a lot of land, and so my charity Sadeh, we took over the running of the whole site. So we've got a big house, and the community come and use we have a swimming pool that's local people use. We're going to develop a cafe, so we really try and work with our local community as well. What I'd say is that we're based on Jewish values, which are really universal values. The particular ones that we work on are Tikkun Olam, which means repairing the world, Bal Tashrit, which means don't destroy or don't waste, and Simcha, which is like happiness and rejoicing, and like touches, I think, a little bit on what Hannah was saying. I think it's so important when we're thinking about climate and faith to be thinking about the rejoicing element, which is so prevalent in so many religions, because otherwise it's all a bit of doom and gloom when it comes to climate. So that's a really big part of what we talk about at Sadeh. We grow vegetables for volunteers and for local people, and we do a lot of workshops and programs at Sadeh. Although of course we've kind of been closed for COVID, but we do have a volunteer program that we're running for people who are vulnerable health-wise, so they don't have safe places to live, so they've come to live at Sadeh. That's kind of potted history of Sadeh and here we are. Talking a bit about Seasons of Creation and Climate Sunday and all of that, and how those really awesome faith-based initiatives tie in with perhaps what the Jewish community is doing in terms of the planet and activism. As Shanon mentioned, this is a really pertinent moment to be discussing this, because it's Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, from Friday night, and then following that is 10 days, we call it the 10 days of awe, which is between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and it's the 10 most serious days in the year. Jewish New Year is not like regular New Year. It is a big festival, but it's mainly a solemn festival. We celebrate it like we celebrate most festivals, with a big feast and quite a lot of synagogue time, but it's supposed to be a time where we recenter, where we think about what we want to do, what we want to give, what we want to share over the next year, and look back. There's a lot of looking back over those 10 days before, up until Yom Kippur, where we think about you know, who we may have upset and that we can ask forgiveness from, how we can, what did we do last year to improve for the next year. Last year it was probably the most meaningful Yom Kippur of my life. It was the Extinction Rebellion protests, and we were I was camping in I think it was near Parliament Square, some big green, and we were staying there overnight, and we really thought about and said out loud like what we were repenting for in terms of the ecological crisis as a community, and just personally, like the things that we do. And it is a relief to speak it out loud and be witnessed in that, yes, we all live in this system, so yes, we make mistakes, and how as a community and as individuals can we take those mistakes and turn them into positive things. And once we say it, once we admit to it, once we talk about it in community, and we can be like held together, it's such a place of healing. You can say, okay, that happened, and now how can we move forward? And that is what we're definitely going to be doing over the next 10 days in the Jewish community. I think many of our rabbis and Kohenet leaders will be talking about the planet in synagogue, and making this kind of a major theme of this year, and hopefully every year to come. Really, it can't really just disappear. Yeah, at Sadeh we'll also be doing that. We have a volunteer program that we're running currently, so we'll be working together and discussing that. I just wanted to say really quickly about, I love the idea of this, of the Jubilee. We talk a lot about ancient Jewish agricultural practices. Judaism, like many religions, is an agricultural religion, is at heart, and one of the many Jewish agricultural laws is called Shemitah, which is every 7 years you leave the land fallow, and every 49th year is the Jubilee year, where everything is, if it's even financial, like if you bought a house from someone, it returns to the person you bought it from. It's a very technical and an amazing way to think about society, even if it's not practical for today. Like the idea of just letting things rest for a whole year is so radical. And what does that even mean in terms of actually growing food? We discuss that a lot, getting into regenerative agriculture and perennials where we're not disturbing the soils, and it's a really great conversation. I'm glad that it's in Christian faithing too.
Thank you, Talia. That was beautiful. And I like how you related so much of that to your farm, to Jewish practices, to your own activism as well with Extinction Rebellion. That's wonderful. There's a question in the chat box that's kind of related to what you've just finished off with. It's from Enid, who asks, does your farm include actions to restore habitats and bring back threatened species?
Yeah, thank you so much, Enid, for your question. Something we talk about a lot at Sadeh is yield. So in regular kind of farming for wheat or grains or whatever, you're thinking about yield and just in terms of crops per acre, how much you can get out of the soil. And in some ways it's a lot more similar to mining than it is to growing, we feel. And so at Sadeh we think about yield in terms of not just what we can grow, but the ways that we can increase our biodiversity, what species we can see on site, what habitats we can develop for different species. We're hoping to develop a whole system called a wet system, which there's not a lot of in the UK, but it's an incredible permaculture system using waste to create water habitats. It's a really key cornerstone of who we are at Sadeh. The land manager is a kind of big permaculture enthusiast who I work closely with. I'm more on the vegetable growing, but yeah, very important to us.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question to that. Would the group be able to visit your farm just for a day?
Yeah, we have a lot of day trips. Obviously regulatory rules allowing, but when we open again to the public, definitely just message me. We organize day trips all the time. We run all kinds of different educational things, just farm tours. You can come meet our chickens.
Thank you so much, Talia. Again, there'll be time for a more general Q&A with Talia at the end. And I forgot to say Shana Tova, so when it comes. So see you again in a bit. But now I'll hand over to Gopal.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Hello, everyone. It's morning here. I'm based in New York City at the moment, so good morning from New York and good afternoon to all of you there. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with all of you today. As Shannon mentioned at the top of the event, I am the founder and the director of a global Hindu effort to address climate change and biodiversity loss. We're called Bhumi Global. Bhumi is a Sanskrit word which means Mother Earth. And the Bhumi Global is actually a very new nonprofit. We've only been in existence for about 2 months, but it builds on the work of the last decade that was done by the Bhumi Project, which was a program of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, which I ran that Bhumi Project initiative since 2009. And in the last couple of years, we've become a new non-profit entity in order to grow and expand our work. And so I can't really talk about much about what we're doing right now, but I can talk about what Bhumi Project and Bhumi Global plans to do. So really the work is around mobilizing and educating Hindu groups and religious leaders globally. Our work historically has focused on greening of Hindu temples and places of pilgrimage in India, in addition to understanding what Hindu texts and traditions have to say when it comes to biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development. And we've done work in Africa, across the United States, India, and the UK, of course, as well. And we're currently in the process of building out a new team in the UK. Two things that we're currently working on right now. The first is a major project around Hinduism and finance, specifically how to mobilize Hindu finance for climate projects globally. So that's something we're working on. And then secondly, not directly, but connected to climate change, is that we work at the UN level, and we are coordinating a major religious push in the lead up to the UN Summit on Biodiversity, which is taking place in about 2 weeks' time. And so we have co-authored a faith statement on biodiversity, and we've had about 50 major religious organizations globally sign on to that statement. And in the UN capacity, we also co-chair the UN's Multi-Faith Advisory Council, which is made up of 40 faith-based organizations globally working on the Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of this question around the work around creation tide and season through creation, and how we can make that an interfaith effort, or if it would be, if it would work as an interfaith effort, I would say that in my experience and in the experience of leading the organizations I have over the past decade, I've found that single faith efforts which try to become multi-faith have to go through certain really quite challenging steps in order to become truly multi-faith. And I would say two of the key things I found when I've been through that process of being part of a single faith entity that's moving into a multi-faith space, or trying to be multi-faith in its work, I would say the two things that I think have been really interesting to see. The first is around language. Because there's work that's been done by George Marshall and Climate Outreach in Oxford that shows that different faith groups talk about climate change and climate action using different words, which are informed by different theologies and philosophies. So one very stark example is that in the mainstream climate movement, we are very happy to talk about climate justice, but when we come to faith traditions, we find that the justice framing fits very strongly with Abrahamic traditions and not so strongly with Eastern and indigenous groups. And so if we were to move from a single to multi-faith model, we would really need to look at the language that we're using to ensure that it encompasses all the traditions that we seek to work. And by sticking to the language of only one or a few traditions, we lose out so much wisdom and expertise. So I think that's one thing that we would need to look at if we're looking at moving from a single to multi-faith model for this specific campaign. The other thing I found is that sometimes the smaller organizations or the minority traditions who are invited into a newly forming interfaith effort from a single major tradition often find that they're still very much in the minority, and they almost can feel like their voice isn't as valued because they're being asked to join a table which is already quite large and dominated by another tradition or other traditions. And I think so that parity, that kind of equality really needs to be looked at quite seriously if we are looking to change from a single faith and effort to a multi-faith effort, and to ensure that the leadership of that new effort reflects what the institution aims to become as well. I think that's also important for smaller minority traditions to see people of their tradition in positions of leadership as we move into a multi-faith setting. So I think those two things I think would be really important to address, but I think there's so much need for more multi-faith collaborative effort when it comes to climate change efforts. The season of creation is a great time of year because it's when schools are going back to work and businesses are opening back up and so on. So it's kind of a good time of year. The weather's still relatively good, so we can go out and do some things. A little bit later in the year, maybe a bit more difficult. So I think the time of year is great. And if we can get the modality and the language right, I think it could be fantastic. And in terms of the final question around connecting religious practice and observance to climate worship and climate action, I love how Hannah said how that line is blurred and oftentimes it's not there at all. And from a Hindu perspective, Hinduism, all the rituals within Hinduism, all the religious practices really, I would say, strive to be at least climate neutral or climate positive, because Hinduism has this understanding that as human beings, we are naturally, without even trying, we are a burden to the earth. Just by getting up in the morning, just by placing our feet on the earth, we are causing harm to the earth. Just by going outside and breathing or driving, we are killing insects and so on like that. Even by eating food, we are killing life forms in order to sustain and nourish ourselves. So just by being a person, even without trying to cause harm, we are causing harm, because that's the nature of reality. And so Hinduism, all the rituals and practices really ask us, minimize that harm, and when you can, do your worship and practice so that you're nullifying the negative results from that. And if you can go beyond that, try to be climate positive, not just climate neutral. And so whether it's I'm chanting on my rosary beads, or whether it's every Hindu home tries to have a tulsi plant, which is a very sacred plant in Hinduism, whether it's trying to look after that plant, or whether it's trying to feed animals, whatever it is, every action should be in the understanding that we're all interconnected, and whatever religious action I have should have a positive environmental impact as well. So that's how I would look at that last question around action and worship.
Thank you so much for that, Gopal. I think that was brilliant. And I love the constructive and critical element as well. And again, yes, so many efforts want to be multi-faith, but then there's a framing issue. There's a subliminal issue, like you said, with the word justice. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that. Like, so does it, then what does it mean in terms of language and the way we frame sort of these multi-faith letters? Like, what would you say to an effort like that said, okay, we want to do this multi-faith thing, let's talk about climate justice as people of faith? Then, you know, what would be your recommendation to reframe that?
You know, I would, because I've just gone through a drafting process for a statement with 5 other faith groups. I've literally just been through this in the last couple of weeks. I would say that, you know, we need to work out, we need to clarify what these terms are, right? So I've been in rooms with 5 Christians from 5 different Christian groups and asked what justice meant, and got 5 different answers. And so for me, if I don't know what, if I can't get one answer from the Christian people I'm working with, I can't go back to it. I can't do that internal translation for, okay, justice means this in a Christian framing, so this is what it means in a Hindu framing. So I think we have to be very clear. I think we throw out these terms quite a lot without even fully digesting that they come from a certain worldview, and even those worldviews can be different. Even the understanding around creation, from the Hindu, one of the main Hindu stories is that there is no creation, there's a manifestation, you know, and there are periods of manifestation and so on. So even just using the word creation could be problematic, because it conveys a certain worldview or a certain theological understanding about how the world came into being. And so I think we really need to unpack these things. And that's why I'm saying it can be difficult if a single faith effort tries to become multi-faith. How much scope is there to really unpack these terms, or is it just better to keep the single faith effort and just start something brand new that's multi-faith at a separate time? So because it does take a lot of work, and existing stakeholders may not feel comfortable unpacking these terms or changing these terms which really resonate with their own constituencies. So that would be an approach I would consider.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. That is a really, really good shout. There's a question in the chat box for you. You have 1 minute for this. Could you speak further about how we are all interconnected?
Yeah, so how are we all interconnected? So from the Hindu perspective, the sun is God, and the sun particles are the different living souls or the living beings. And so we are all interconnected to God, and therefore, because we are each individual souls connected to God, therefore we are all interconnected with each other. So that's a very quick way of understanding that.
Thank you so much. And there's just a comment in the website as well. Gopal would be interested in seeing your multi-faith statement, even if it is just in draft form. Any way of people being able to access that?
Sure, I can put it in the chat box right now. I have it to hand. It's a biodiversity statement, and people are welcome to sign on to it, representing their organizations.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Gopal. Again, we'll see you again in a bit, but now I hand over to Caspar.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks to Faith for Climate Change as well. Oh, there's a very big, I can suddenly see my face in a really big way. That's a bit disconcerting. Yeah, as Shannon said, I didn't start Buddhist Action Month, but I've been running it for the past couple of years. That's an initiative to get Buddhists more engaged, socially engaged, and particularly for the last couple of years engaged with the climate crisis. 5 minutes, okay. When I said to my wife, I've just got 5 minutes, it feels like a lot of pressure to get through all these big questions. She said, just be yourself, which I think is probably good advice. So I'm going to try and relax and not worry if I don't address everything that I wanted to address. Thank you, Gopal, for raising those points about language. When I saw that I was being invited to speak about creation, I must admit there was a little bit of a reaction in me, because this kind of doesn't mean anything from a Buddhist point of view. I think when we approach a new faith or a different faith, and speaking as a convert Buddhist, I've been through this experience personally. Of course, there's a stage where we look to make sense of the other tradition in terms of the philosophy or the tradition that we know already. And that's really useful and valuable. One of the favorite books of mine from last year was Paul Nitter's, that I read last year. It's not from last year. It was Paul Nitter's book, Without Buddha, I Couldn't Be a Christian. So that's a really valuable and rich exercise, making sense of another tradition from our own tradition. But at some point in interfaith dialogue, and for me as a convert Buddhist, there's a place for going beyond that and asking, what do these things mean in their own terms? How do I understand them in their own context? So if not creation, how do I make sense? How do Buddhists make sense of the universe? There's this idea that it is both beginningless and endless. We think in Buddhism about vast amounts of time and conditions, changing conditions, affecting one another all through history, right from some point, in fact, not from a point, but just this infinite spectrum of time that goes forwards and backwards. And that allows me as a climate activist to rest in something that is not urgent. And there's a kind of tension here between the urgency of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and this view of the universe as something that is unending. It allows me to have a little bit of ease when I'm facing these huge issues. And of course, the Buddha also spoke about urgency. He encouraged us to practice as if a hair was on fire, which is a really powerful image, particularly when we think of the wildfires in the United States at the moment. Practice as if your hair is on fire. And there's all of this unending time to do that in. So there's a kind of invitation here to sit with both of these different qualities, that sense of the eternal and that sense of we must do something now in this moment. I guess personally that resources me in a particular way. The Buddha spoke about when you're practicing, you should be tuned like the wire on a stringed instrument, neither too tight nor too loose. And of course, in my own practice as a Buddhist and as a climate activist, sometimes I am strung too tightly, and noticing that and remembering to tune back into the right amount of tension is a useful practice, particularly useful as I sat facing a line of police in high-vis jackets a couple of weeks ago. I will pause there because I can see I'm out of time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Caspar. Again, I think that was wonderful. And just to lay it out in the open to everyone, yes, I had to explain to Caspar that I really didn't want this to be an exclusive event, and I really wanted it to work for everyone. But again, you know, the limitations of language, I found myself failing to explain, you know, what this event was meant to be, that we were trying to honor a season of creation, but also trying to open it up, crack it open, and look at how language, you know, can be a barrier, it can be an enabler. So I really like what you said, Caspar, about there is value in trying to translate someone else's faith in our own terms, but it cannot stop there. We have to go forward. We have to try and understand things as the other person understands it, even if it's not our own. Or maybe one day it does become our own, or we find a way, you know, I don't know. my view of our spiritual journeys, it can be so complex and diverse for everyone, right? I mean, the book that I'm reading now is Zen and the Birds of Appetite by Thomas Merton, which I find really valuable also. But again, as he says as well, it can't stop there. It has to go further than that. So I really like what you said about that. And I really like the concepts that you've left us with also, this beginninglessness and endlessness. And that lovely saying, tune yourself like, as a wire on a stringed instrument. I really like that. You've been involved in Extinction Rebellion. I suppose my question to you is, then, I think you can see it in the press as well and how Extinction Rebellion is represented. There's a lot of, backlash. There's some really strong feelings that people have about Extinction Rebellion. And I wonder what your Buddhist practices give you in that space. What sort of resources do they offer you when it comes to that?
Yeah, thank you, Shanon. I am a Pure Land Buddhist, so I practice quite devotionally compared to many Buddhists in the West. I practice with a Buddha called Amitabha, who is the Buddha that accepts you just as you are. And for me, having that quite personal devotional relationship with something other than myself, that doesn't need me to be anything in particular, and I'm sure this will be familiar to people of many different faith traditions, allows me to weather whatever is happening around me, both in the press and also more personal comments as well.
Yeah. And I was just wondering also, what do you do with emotions such as, I don't know, fear, or in that moment, when it gets really risky?
Yeah, so for me, I think a lot of the work was preceding that and making space for those emotions, really welcoming them, finding ways to welcome them into myself, not rejecting any part of my experience. So both having one eye on the Buddha or one on my feet in faith and welcoming whatever is arising, grief, fear, even anger. Why do I have to be here doing this really crazy, unlawful thing? Because the system is so stubborn in its reluctance to change the way that it does things. So just welcoming whatever arises, both personally and then finding community spaces where we can support each other to do that.
Thank you. I don't see any questions from the chat box. We'll come back to this. There'll be a general question that I'll ask. But I suppose I wanted to finish with, at the launch of the Faith Bridge, the vigil that we had in front of St. John's Waterloo, you told this really powerful story about the Buddha and two kingdoms, was it, that were going to war? And I just wondered if you wanted to share that again here, because I thought it was a powerful
Yeah, I'll
story.
try and do that briefly. I also want to apologize because I know that I can't stay till the end of this meeting because I have another meeting at 5 o'clock. So the story is, the northern India, Nepal at the time, was divided into lots of different states. And the Buddha was a friend and advisor to many of the leaders of those states. And it came to pass that two of them had decided to go to war with each other. So the Buddha tried to advise each of them that this was a bad idea, and they refused the advice. So he found a place to sit where he could see these armies marching towards each other. And he just rested on the earth in this place of vigil and witness. And for me, there's something really powerful in that. And it's part of what I felt I was doing a week ago, 2 weeks ago in London. Regardless of the impact that these demonstrations and protests have, there is something really profoundly important about grounding ourselves in our faith and on the earth and witnessing, bearing witness to what's unfolding in these times.
Thank you so much for that. And good. So now,
yes, I'll say, I'll just reply to Colin very quickly. Yes, Colin, often I find that it's, for me, as quite a devotional Buddhist, it's easier to relate to some of the ideas in interfaith communities than it is in intra-Buddhist world. So yes, it's certainly true that there's big differences between traditions within each of the faith groups as well as across traditions.
Thank you. Casper, do you have a few minutes for just one question that came in through the email? This is for all of you, actually, all four speakers, if you could take turns to answer this. This came in the email. Someone said, I'd be grateful to hear how the panelists' faith perspectives offered them a resource from which to meet runaway climate change, and what manner of hope their spirituality witnesses to in this context. So I think a question about hope and your own practices and beliefs and so on. Yeah. Casper, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Shannon. So for me, I don't know if I've got any hope for the world. What my faith does allows me to be in a place of hopelessness. My teacher talks about being a happy pessimist. So he finds solace and joy in his practice, whilst not really knowing how things are going to go for the whole world. So I trust that I can find ways of loving my neighbours and my friends and people and living beings all over the world. And that is really the most important thing. And I will continue to do that whether the world crumbles around me or whether we're able to turn things around and save species and biodiversity and so on.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Gopal, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, a little bit like Casper, not so much about hope, but focusing on just what I can do. Knowing that I have a circle of influence, and that let me just do what I can, and then everyone else, if everyone just does that, then we can get to a better place. And so for me, that framework really comes out of the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna is speaking to Arjun, and Arjun has a mental breakdown in the middle of a war, and Krishna tells him, just do what you can. Don't try to do everything, and don't try to do the activity of someone else. You have your own skills and qualities and influence. Just focus on that, be really good at that, and that's all you can contribute. And you have to hope that that's enough, and if for everyone else to do the same, then we can get to a better place. So for me, it's less about hope, but it's more about what is in my control, what can I influence, and what can I contribute. And I think that for me helps me not get caught up in the despair of the totality of the crisis that we're in, if I can just focus on my little area of the world and my little area of work. So that's how I approach it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gopal. Talia, where are you?
Hi. Huge question. I just want to speak to also what the question was before about are there like differences within my tradition, and Shannon, also you saying in the beginning, like obviously I don't represent the whole of Judaism, and this is saying 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So this is probably the same with this question, where is hope in the face of the darkness of climate change? I think Judaism often marries well despair and rejoicing and celebration. You do not really have one without the other. Even on a wedding day, a happy, joyous day, you smash a glass to remember the destruction of the temple, and it's metaphorical, really, to remind, not to bring you down in happy occasions, but to remember that you're a part of the world, and bad things and good things always have to go hand in hand. And so just like we have to stand on a glass in a wedding, so also in like the times of despair, so we laugh the loudest and the hardest. And comedy is like a huge thing in Judaism, because there's been many a times where the Jewish people have faced a tragedy that seems so dark that there may be no light at the end of the tunnel, but there always is. And we have so many celebrations built into the religion, which involve sitting with each other, sharing a meal, sharing a story, lighting a candle, smelling nice herbs, all these things to remember that there is always space for, and not just space, like there's often a commandment to rejoice, because we still live in this planet, like this divinely inspired, divinely created, whatever planet, and we must take pleasure in it where we can and how we can. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I think that was lovely and multi-layered and just very profound. Hannah.
Yeah, I think really resonate with what Talia's just said as well about that combination of kind of hope and lament being together, and actually that means that both of those things can be deep rooted. And I think for me personally, the kind of something we often talk about as Christians is the kind of now and not yet of redemption and salvation, and recognizing that whilst God promises that there will be kind of full redemption of creation and of the earth at some point, that doesn't mean we just look to a point in the future where that will come about, but actually now we can see that process happening. We can see that redemption coming about in glimpses of hope and creation that we partner with God. And I think I find that hope in not just a kind of long-term and a future promise, but a recognition that there are moments we can bring about in partnership with God now that see the restoration of creation, if only temporary. And I think I find, that tension between the two a hopeful space to be in, because it promises long-term and change now.
Thank you. There are questions still in the chat box, but I'm mindful of time. I'm sorry if I can't get to all of them. I guess I will end with this because this is the question that came first. Cliff has said, in the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si', he's identified that it's runaway consumerism and indifference in globalization that's causing the destruction of the environment. So he has this very social and political analysis of the causes of climate change. But Cliff's question is, to what extent can all the different faith views here embrace and find a response to this collectively, from our different standpoints, like this idea that it's runaway consumerism and exploitation that's destroying the world? Anyone, quickly, 30 seconds each. Who wants to go?
I would just say that I think there are some really helpful images and stories and pictures in all of our faith traditions that help us to counter that picture of kind of destructive consumerism, and sharing those together and sharing those stories and pictures can be an amazing starting point for just seeing the alternative, seeing ways that live in flourishing ways rather than in destructive ways, and just sharing those stories together can be a place to start.
Thank you, Hannah. Gopal or Talia, did you have anything you wanted to add? Gopal.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that I don't think anyone can really argue with Pope Francis when he says that. I think that's the root of the issue. But I would say that I think we need to also, in order to bring as many people on the journey with us, we can't just demonize capitalism and consumerism, but as Hannah was saying, really uplift that it's taken people out of poverty. It has uplifted people. There are still parts of the world that need economic growth. And so I think in order to take people with us on the journey, we have to also lift up the positives that have come about over the last couple of 100 years, but also talk about the transformation that needs to take place for the future as well.
Thanks, Gopal. Talia and Kaspar, if you're still with us, but Talia, go first.
Yeah, the conversation has to be intersectional. Yes, just rampant consumerism is a massive problem, and yes, we can't just say, well, let's just everyone stop by, like exactly what Gopal was saying. There's a broader context here, and a wider world to think of, and I think, just as Hannah was saying, it's about thinking about the metaphors, the traditions, the stories that we have, that are passed down to us, to think about how we can live, what futures we can see, how it can work, without being like, we're right, you're wrong, you need to stop what you're doing and not industrialize or whatever. It's got to be a broad conversation. It's got to include everyone. That's why interfaith is so important.
Thank you. Thanks, Talia. That's right on the dot of 5 o'clock. But before we go, and before I say a proper thank you to our panelists, I just wanted to share with all of you what you can expect in the coming months from us. So we won't have a public webinar in October because we are focusing on a series of skills building workshops focused specifically around communities in Leeds, Leicester and Manchester. They'll be conducted by Zoom, but we're focusing on these communities and they will be multi-faith. If you're interested, if you know anyone in these areas, or if you are from Leeds, Leicester or Manchester and you want to know more about the workshops, please email me. My details are on the website. Contact or get in touch with us via Twitter. That's our handle. We will have more public events again in November, especially for Interfaith Week. There'll be quite a few webinars happening, and there's quite a few COP26 placeholding activities that we're doing in collaboration with groups like Hope for the Future and Footsteps in Birmingham. So watch that space. Please sign up as a member. It's free of charge. You get our e-news. You get events that are specifically tailored to members. But in the meantime, I guess what I wanted to do before I let all of you go is just to thank our panelists very, very much for a wonderful conversation. You all brought such wonderful, heartfelt perspectives. I loved it. Loved talking to you, Hannah, Talia, Gopal, and Casper. Thank you for your brilliant work, and thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Faith for the Climate team as well, Giles, Checky, Lizzie, for holding the fort. Yes, and thank you everyone. See you at our next event and have a great rest of the week.